Is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today will be another installment of my year in review for Sharks players. This time, number 8, Joe Pavelski. Of course, everybody knows at this point that this was Joe Pavelski's final year as a San Jose Shark, as he signed a 3-year deal with the Dallas Stars, not, excluding the fact that he could potentially return to the Sharks at the end of that deal, or, something like what is happening with Marleau could occur then, but he at least won't be on the Sharks this next season, so this may be one of the final times I'll ever review Joe Pavelski's performance. And so his frequent pairings, or I guess frequent line mates during the season, in the regular season, it was mostly Meier, Couture, and Pavelski. This was the first line for the Sharks for, near the end half of the season. He had other line mates near the start when he was playing with players like Kane and Donskoy, especially before the arrival of Gustav Nyquist. Into the playoffs, he was still with Meier and Couture. However, once he got injured in Game 7 of the Golden Knights and Nyquist took his spot on that first line, once Pavelski did return in Game 7 against the Avalanche, he ended up on a line with Kane and Hertl, and that's where he spent the majority of the time for the rest of the playoffs. And so it was pretty clear that Joe Pavelski was frequently in the top 6, as you would expect for a player of his caliber. For his stats in the regular season, he had 75 games played, only missing a few games here or there, 38 goals, which was the most on the team. That also includes 6 game winners, which was tied for the most on the team with Brent Burns, 26 assists and 64 points, very respectable point totals. A -4, nothing to really write home about. It's not super impressive, but it's also really not that bad, especially for a forward like Joe Pavelski. What is a very interesting stats is his power play points, 21 power play points. That includes 12 power play goals, meaning of his 64 points, just about a third of them came on the power play. And we know the Sharks power play was actually quite successful during the regular season, at the very least, coming in at around 6th place in the league, if I'm not mistaken. Joe Pavelski being a huge part of that on the first power play unit. And so the player who will be replacing Pavelski, likely Timo Meier, at least at the start of the season, will have some big shoes to fill. Because, as we all know, Joe Pavelski was one of the best players in the league when it came to tipping pucks in, and on the power play with that extra room, since the other team has one less player, Pavelski was able to find many more positions. And when you consider that they have Brent Burns and Erik Karlsson firing cannons from the point, and Joe Pavelski is so good at this, it's no wonder why he was able to rack up a ton of power play points. Timo Meier, all respect to him, still a very good player, but he doesn't necessarily have that same skill as Joe Pavelski when it comes to that. So it'll be interesting to see if the Sharks power play actually does suffer, or if maybe they will adapt their strategy around missing Joe Pavelski, because, feeding pucks to the net with just random Brent Burns wrist shots and slap shots, same with Erik Karlsson, was actually a pretty valid strategy when you have Joe Pavelski standing in front. But now that he's gone, you have to wonder what they're going to try and do. For time on ice, it also shows Pavelski's huge role with the team, as he had 19 minutes and 3 seconds, which led the team in terms of forwards for time on ice. He was slightly behind Evander Kane when it came to even strength time on ice, but still it shows that Peter DeBoer heavily relied on Joe Pavelski. He didn't have too much shorthanded ice time, so it was mostly even strength and power play ice time, but still it's going to be a pretty big hole to fill as you'll look into the next season, and you'll see that the Sharks will have Kevin Labanc hopefully being a top 6 member, and then maybe somebody else, maybe from the system, maybe the Sharks will sign somebody, and you're going to have to get one of them to try and fill in those minutes, and you might not want it to be that new player, whether it be a prospect or the free agent. You might not want it to be Labanc unless he really develops, and so a lot of it will likely fall on the shoulders of Timo Meier, whose ice time has been pretty middling, mostly at around the 15 or so mark during this past season. I suspect that will have to jump up by at least a couple of minutes going into this next season, as he will take on an expanded role with the signing of Joe Pavelski by the Dallas Stars. For the playoffs, he played 13 games. Of course, he missed the majority of the Avalanche series due to his injury. 4 goals, 5 assists, and 9 points. -3, so again, nothing really to write home about. 3 power play points, which once again is 1/3 of his points that he had during the playoffs. So again, showing himself to be a pretty key member of the power play. And then in terms of ice time, not surprising that it goes up, but it is still a pretty high 19 minutes and 39 seconds, which is still near the tops for Sharks forwards. And so again, in the playoffs, especially when you don't want to necessarily rely on some of these younger players who might not have as much experience, like someone like Kevin Labanc or like Timo Meier, Joe Pavelski was leaned on heavily by Peter DeBoer. We know how much DeBoer loved Joe Pavelski. With him being gone now, it's again likely going to fall on the shoulders of Timo Meier to really step into that role, unless someone like Kevin Labanc could really surprise, or if whoever's filling in for that top 6 role could really surprise, whether or not that be someone from the system again, or someone like a Dzingel or like a Johansson, who the Sharks could still potentially make a move for if they can make the salary cap space for. On to his grades. During the first quarter, he had a B-, second quarter B+, third quarter A-, fourth quarter B-, and then for the playoffs, a B- as well. So that basically all averaged out to just about a final grade of a B for the season. A pretty impressive season for Joe Pavelski. As I said, he led the team in goals, which is obviously very good. He had pretty hefty ice times as well. He was strong on the power play. The main criticism for Joe Pavelski is that his even strength play somewhat left something to be desired. He wasn't extremely dominant at even strength. You take a look at players like Tomas Hertl, who could at times just dominate the ice. You could really look at the end of a specific regular season game and say, well, Tomas Hertl really stood out. It wasn't really like that with Joe Pavelski. Even when he was getting points, it was mostly like, hey, Joe Pavelski got a couple of points here. That's cool. But it was never like, wow, Pavelski was all over the ice, because, that wasn't really his style of game. So still a very impressive season, but it wasn't necessarily something extremely dominant. However, one thing is for sure is that when taking a look at all these stats, the goals, the time on ice, the power play points, it's pretty clear that little Joe will leave a pretty big hole for the Sharks to fill. Class dismiss.